Hi, everyone. I'm BJ, and I'm a genealogist and librarian here in Maine. And tonight's program is the second part of a two-part set on immigration. The first one, I talked more about the history of the politics and the actual regulations. And tonight, I'm going to go through the actual records that reflect those changes. And one of the big things you will see um, is something that's true of all sorts of record sets we look at as genealogists, census, vital records, even military records, that the more recent something is, the more detailed it's likely to be. Um, and the period from 1850 to 1900 saw an absolute explosion in data that was collected. Um, if you ever want to look at that dramatically, find somebody, look at the 1850 census and look at the 1900 census, and you'll see an incredible difference. And it's the same thing with vital records. In 1850, there were, I know Massachusetts already had required registration of vital records, and there may have been one or other two states, but by 1900, about half were. And by 1920, almost all were. So we're going to see the same thing with these records. And so what I'm going to do is go through these. I am going to focus a fair bit more than most people do on land border crossings, because here in New England and through to New York and Michigan, they're very important from people coming to and from Canada. And I wanted to make sure I showed that, because almost any of you who deal with people in your trees with a French last name, you're probably at some point here in New England going to go back to Quebec or New Brunswick or possibly parts of Ontario, and not directly to France. Um, and it's also true that many people of Scots-Irish, and Irish ancestry went to Nova Scotia and New Brunswick before a descendant made it to New England. Um, or even with the old New England English Yankee names, you get people who went to Nova Scotia as loyalists, Ontario as loyalists, and then a couple generations later, descendants came back to the US. And so there was a lot of traffic across the US-Canada border. I will briefly touch on how the records looked on the US-Mexico border as well. There, you're mostly getting people whose families have been in Mexico for several generations, rather than one or two that we tend to see here in New England, or um, the French Canadian people with Spanish surnames who go back and forth across the border. Um, so anyway, let's take a look at this, and let's start with the PowerPoint. I want to start from the current slide because we did the earlier slides 2 weeks ago. So here we go. And are you now seeing my screen?
Yep.
Good. All right. So immigration part 2, the actual records that were generated when our ancestors moved around. Let's take a look at these. Spend some time on border crossings, um, because they were fairly frequent in New England and New York and in Michigan. Um, you get some further west, but they're essentially modern, and so those records won't be available for privacy reasons. So we'll start with this. This is a 1910 passenger list coming from Glasgow, Scotland to New York City in 1910. Um, my grandfather was on this ship. He missed the 1910 census by days. And so here you see him, Edward Jameson, age 16, male, single, printer. He can read and write. He's UK citizen, um, Scottish, born in Scotland, and heading to, oh, this is his father is his closest relative in the old country, and he's headed to Cleveland, Ohio. So by 1910, you're getting this detail. There's a second page of this with more information about how much money he had, who had paid his fare. He had paid it himself. I'm guessing that it was actually a family um, project to pay for it. Um, so, but you'll see a lot of cases where it's, a husband pays for a wife and oldest two children to come over and such. Um, what's interesting is the UK at this point also has outgoing registers that are also at Ancestry. And so if we look at this, here he is, Edward Jameson. Interestingly, he's called a plumber here, although he was a printer on the incoming. So I didn't think he was really either of those. He ends up being called a laborer on a bunch of other records. So I don't know what happened there. He's 16. And what they did here is these are people on the ship who were British citizens. And if you were English, you were in this column, Welsh, Scotch, Irish, or colonial. And since this was sailing from Glasgow, you can see everybody is in the Scottish category. And these top numbers are carried over from the previous page. So that's so you can see both ends of the voyage there. So let's look at border crossings. And we're going to see my grandfather more in this because he went back and forth multiple times. One of the things to know is that in Scotland, Ireland, and England, less in Wales, um, there was great pushing for settlement in Canada. And so into the 20th century, when the US had stopped giving out land, you still had parts of Canada that were either giving out land or selling it really inexpensively. And so you could buy a ticket from Glasgow to a port in Canada and then a train ticket to somewhere where you could get low cost land. And as you can see here, they were charging $15 for adults, and children under 17 were free. Um, so there was, as I said, a pretty good um, effort to get people out of the slums of the various cities in the UK. So land border crossings, on average, you're going to have less information um, than people arriving on ship. Um, that was just how the records were kept. Um, interestingly, from 1895 to the 1920s, the St. Albans, Vermont district for land crossings extended from Maine out to Michigan, if I remember correctly, because the man who headed it lived in St. Albans. I mean, isn't that how bureaucracy works? This is where I am, so this is the district it's called. But then after 1927, they put in more districts. But often Ancestry's gotten better about this, but at times you will see something indexed as St. Albans, and it turns out at one of the big genealogy sites, and it turns out that it's not St. Albans. It's somewhere in Maine, it's somewhere in New York. So you want to be careful about that. I've seen people make, not read the details and just take the St. Albans district as where somebody crossed. If you go to the card catalog at Ancestry and put in border as the key word, notice that, and then what I did is instead of by date added, I sorted by record count because some of these were some of the earlier data sets they had. So by doing it by record count, you can see you've got border crossings from Canada to the US, from Mexico to the US. Here's Detroit. Now, this is interesting because it has both border crossings, plus you got some ships that came through that, so you get passenger lists rather than border crossing records. And then you also get from the US to Canada. Um, and so if you have an ancestor who's going back and forth, you definitely would want to check both of these. And you might want to check this even if you don't think they went through Detroit, just to be safe. Because you never know how somebody went. But you can see that there are lots of things. So here you see US people coming into the US from Canada, and then Canada has records from the US going to Canada. And you generally are more likely to get the records where somebody is going to than from. In some cases, like the UK, they did keep outgoing records as well, which is very handy to be able to pair people up. And so you can see here, this is going from Canada coming into the US, and you can see how you've got St. Albans and then different places start breaking off. So you can see here in the early 20th century, you start getting Calais, Jackman, Fort Fairfield, Van Buren, and Vanceboro being places that people crossed officially. There was a lot of daily back and forth that's not recorded. So this is a sample of one of the early St. Albans, and as you can see, it's the port of Van Buren. And so here you have the people, you have their occupation, nationality, where they last resided, name of their nearest relative or friend in the country where the alien came from, their final destination. As you can see here, we've got Skowhegan, Van Buren, South Brewer, Fort Fairfield. And you get people who were French extraction and people who were Irish, but they're all Canadian citizens. Here's a border crossing record. I think this one's Vanceboro. Notice it's not very legible. I did do some little bits here so you can read it a bit better. So yeah, it's Vanceboro, and you get somewhat the same information that you get on a passenger list. Have they been in the US before? When were they born? Their occupation. So this man was a Canadian Pacific Railroad cook, born in St. Charles, Quebec, and so on. I probably, if I got this out of PowerPoint and went into a real photo editor, I could make this a little more accessible. Many of these were not well scanned. And again, here we have from Canada, again, you get St. Albans. And you'll notice they've got two different sets with when all of these are St. Albans, and then you see sometimes things got put onto multiple microfilm reels. And so one reason to look at this when you are at something like this is to see what else, are these on the same roll? Are they not? And you see things begin to peter out in the 1950s for privacy reasons. Or when they went to microfilm these in the 70s, they did through the 50s and they haven't bothered to do it since. Does that make sense to everybody? How things, taper off. And I think for most of us, if it's something post 1950s, we generally know that information. So that's something to keep in mind. And so here's a crossing. This is from um, the US to Canada. And again, here we have my grandfather, once again listed as a printer. So I'm assuming the plumber on the outgoing one was probably the mistake. He's on a train. He's saying he's from Cleveland, Ohio. He's going to Meaford, Ontario. He has $8 with him and he's going to his sister. Um, so this is in 1912. So it's almost 3 years after he came to Cleveland. And then in 1923, we get him coming from Canada back to the US. He'd been living in Canada for a while. In between these, he'd actually gone back to Scotland with the um, Canadian Expeditionary Forces in World War One. And you get his sister. I still haven't figured out who this Mrs. McInerney is, um, but that's who he's going to. I think, and this is not the part of Buffalo he ends up settling in. Um, this is in the southern part of the city, and he ends up settling in the northwestern part later on. So I don't know. But again, he says he's been to Cleveland. This is actually what started me on some of this journey, is saying he'd been in Cleveland before, because I'd been told that he and his three brothers went to Toronto. But you get some physical description, wrong year on when he first came, but the right ship name. So, and you'll find that a lot on these. People will be off a year or two. So don't panic when you see that. And then here we have another one. I think I blew this up. Oops, hit the wrong thing. So again, here you see, here he is with his brother this time. So this one was March, and then he comes again. So he must have gone back to Canada at some point, because in March he's coming into the US, and then October he's coming into the US. So that's it's worth keeping looking, because sometimes they did write things down. You also get this. I don't know. For example, the last couple times I've gone to Scotland, I've actually flown into Dublin, spent a couple days in Ireland, and then gone on to Scotland. And then when I flew out of Dublin to come back to the US, you go through US customs in Dublin. It's US border people. Um, and I know there are other ports in Europe that do the same thing. This is the same thing. This ship is going from Glasgow to, I think it was either Halifax or Montreal, but some people were going on to the US. And so you get these here, this list of examined there, and then they get an alien certificate for when they get down to, in this case, Detroit. Um, and so that same thing where they're passing through Canada, kind of going through Canadian customs, but they're also getting pre-approved for U.S. immigration at this point. Um, so this is in 1925. This is not my family, but it was one where I was easily able to find the linked. Um, and you'll notice he has an immigration visa at this point because of that change in the law in 1924 I talked about a couple of weeks ago. If he'd been a couple years earlier, he probably wouldn't have needed that. Very quickly, just in case anyone has this, you get the same thing with all sorts of different border crossings and where you may have things on multiple, um, actually multiple microfilms. And so this Eagle Pass that's on two, it may be divided by years or it may be divided, it may be alphabetical. I didn't go to see, but you can see how there's some places that have a, and this may also be that there may be two different border stations in Laredo, for example. The populations along the US Mexico border are much greater than along the US or the Maine Canada border. Whereas I know, for example, in New York and Buffalo, there are four. I think one of them may be commercial only now, but when I was growing up, there were four border crossings in that stretch along the Niagara River. And so those might be put in here separately, or they might be put in all as that stretch. One of the other things to check, I thought this was interesting, and this is why you want to double check everything. Related data collections. Mexico baptisms, that makes sense. Mexico marriages makes sense. Missouri, that doesn't make sense in this context. Somebody misread some abbreviation somewhere, or there's a glitch. But Missouri is about as far as close to the center of the US as you can get. So it's probably not going to be relevant to border crossings from Mexico to the US. So just something to make sure you're reading and don't accidentally click on this thinking it's Mexico or New Mexico marriage records. And just a close up of this so you can see the sorts of years there are records for. And mm, and it, 20th century, you get a lot of this is under the Department of Labor or Commerce and Labor. You get immigrant, sometimes this will say just visitor. Um, you often get last residence rather than, you've noticed on these, rather than place. Um, so something to be aware of on the Mexico border ones. And again, here you have one, where the Growers Association is bringing in labor. Um, so that, accompanied by mother, um, even though she's 39, her mother's with her. Um, and what's interesting on these, and you don't see these on the Canadian ones as much, by whom admitted, this is the name of the official who stamped approval. And you get it here as well. I haven't seen that on any Canadian border crossings. Um, this one does have a birthplace as well as a last residence. Um, and so, you get, this is someone who's 2 years old and 10 years old. So you're getting documentation for children on this. and an early form of some of the quick entry, um, these border permit cards or identification cards for laborer. Um, so these are early 1920s attempting to keep track of who's going back and forth frequently. So let's look at passenger lists. These are going to be by water. The border crossings are land. Um, so until 1820, there was no requirement for passenger lists. From 1820 to 1899 or 1891, customs house, immigration port used their own form. And so they weren't standardized. If the person in charge in the port changed this, the form could change. And so, Salem, Massachusetts, Boston, Massachusetts, and Portland, Maine could have all ask for different information, have a different format they use. So that's something to keep in mind. So what happened is in the 1930s, collected all of the surviving passenger lists they could get their hands on, and they were sent to the National Archives and then microfilmed. And as you saw, some countries or ports kept outgoing passenger lists. People in Germany and several ports in the UK did. So it's worth looking. And remember that on the European end, you often get things the way you do here, where somebody traveled to the port where the combination of the rail ticket and the action fare was the cheapest. And so sometimes you get people leaving from places that you weren't expecting. Um, so that's something to keep in mind. Bremen, Hamburg, Germany, Cherbourg, France, Southampton, England, Glasgow, Liverpool, Dublin, Cork were some of the biggest ports, at least for the northern part of North America, and would have had train lines going from good chunks of the country they were in to the port. Now, before 1820, you sometimes get lucky, and even afterwards, you sometimes do. This is an account of a ship that went from Liverpool to New York City in 1802. It took 52 days. And my several greats grandfather, John Leroy, the one who 6 years later dies in Boston Harbor and has that broadside with the poem about he shouldn't have been doing a pleasure sail on the Sabbath because he got what he was due to him for doing that when the squall came up and drowned him and his son. You will get lists of people coming off ships. These are the people on that ship. The other thing I've seen early on sometimes, I've helped a couple people where we have found a list, say in the 1830s or 40s, when we couldn't find a passenger list. A hotel near the docks has a list of its the people staying there in the newspaper. And we can figure out from an unusual name that they were there for a week before they went what would now be an hour drive, out of the port where they were settling. Um, so that's thing to be aware of is if you're not finding early passenger lists or pre-passenger lists, look to see if there's something sort of 1790s and on. I haven't really seen much of this before that. But it's worth checking the newspapers to see if someone is listed as newly off a ship or staying at a hotel. This is an early passenger list. Um, in many cases, these early ships, they are both cargo and people. Um, and so as you can see here, not many people. You get name, age, sex. You do get these are they say it's passengers, but these are actually the people on the ship. You've got the oh, sorry, these are merchants and mariners. So you get an occupation. A lot of these you don't get that. You just get, and some of them I've seen, all you get is a name. And as we get a little later on, you get name, you get age, sex, calling or profession, country which they reside, intended destination. This is into Boston. And so you've got everybody's Massachusetts except one person for Illinois, um, where they were on the ship, how much baggage they had. But still, you're not getting all that much. And in many cases, um, I've noticed that you get, in some cases, only the head of the household. Other times, you do get the wife and children listed. They were supposed to list them, is my understanding. But I have seen cases where it's pretty clear that there was a family and only one person is named. So again, here's a passenger list coming into Canada. And here we have my grandfather's three brothers. Um, and this is actually their sister who'd gone back to get them. And so you get, this is interesting on the Canadian one, you actually get what religion. You don't get that on the US one. But you get occupation in the country you came from, intended occupation in Canada, where they're going, and so on. So you get some pretty um, nice detail on the Canadian ones. One of the other things that's worth looking at, there were immigrant aid societies, um, both in originating countries and in the US and Canada. Um, Irish potato famine, Highland clearances, um, various other times. There were schemes essentially in the British sense, not the American sense of just a program to encourage people to emigrate because there was all this land available and you had people living in horrendous slums in the 19th century in the UK. And so you did have the big landowners, religious groups, um, and so on, paying the fare for people to go to Canada, the US, Australia, New Zealand. So that's you. You also get at the other end. For example, you get the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society helped started with the Russian Jews coming out of areas with pogroms in the late 19th century in Russia and other Eastern European places. Um, and people, they were helping people come over. Um, and you also get, and then helping them settle. But they have records. The Boston records are available through the, and I'm forgetting the name of the subdivision. It's like the Weiner Family History Center that's part of that's affiliated with the New England Historical and Genealogical Society in Boston. But these often, because they were dealing with not only the immigration, but integration into they wanted to make sure people were Jewish. And so often it does tell, the record tells what little town they'd come from, who they already knew here, who they knew, same thing. So you get these for Italian communities, you get them for, I know there were Polish Catholic versions of this in places. Um, so that's something to look for is, was there an organization? You know, there was, there were also Irish organizations in um, Boston that helped. And some of them would have been broken down by where somebody had come from. And so you'd have a Lithuanian Jewish community, subcommunity, and a Polish Jewish subcommunity. And did they speak Yiddish or Polish? That type of thing. So that's one of the other, and I'll talk a bit more about some of these when we talk about finding origins, because this is another place that you can find them, but it's a way to confirm. The reason I mention this, I'm going to show a couple other things, is when you have those passenger lists that don't have much information, sometimes this type of file will have more, and it'll have the date somebody came over so you can see, is this the person I'm looking for? Yeah, it's the Weiner Jewish Heritage Center. Um, so that's something to be aware of for New England. On the Irish, there was a column in one of the Boston papers called The Search for Missing Friends. And this is now all online as well as in, I think it's an 8-volume print set. It was in the Boston Pilot, started in 1831, really took off after the famine. And again, I'm going to talk more about this when we talk about looking for origins. But when you have these Boston passenger, especially you have these pre-1891 passenger lists that just have a name and very little other information, being able to look and see if somebody was looking for your person. Some of these had information. Let me show you one here. So here's an early one. John Delahunty of Clonmore, County Tipperary, arrived in America in 1818. And so this is pre-passenger list. But it tells you might find him in the 1820 census. Um, it's saying his nephew has arrived in Boston. And so I'm guessing this Michael Delahunty in Boston 1831 is his nephew. And that could be a good clue. So pages for the pre-passenger list. But even later, you're getting things where here's a girl, Margaret Cummins, who arrived in New York on the ship Probus in 1841. And so if you have a passenger list that just has her name, you'd want to look and see. I'm assuming that this Richard Cummins is the distressed parent. And so these are worth, this is the sort of thing that's worth looking at to see if you can figure out if that, Patrick Murphy on the ship list is your Patrick Murphy. And some of these get fairly detailed. He had been in the English Army. He was in the Crimean War. He went to America some years ago. His father's in New York. His sisters are in England. So this would give you some information if you found a John Caulfield you say, who had immigrated in 1865. Maybe that's him. Um, so, and then this is an interesting set. These are on the Maine State Archives website. And those of you who've been around a while will probably recognize these when I show them. And again, I'm going to talk about them more with the finding origins. But because the border between the US and Canada was a little porous for a good chunk of its existence, um, in 1940, when the US was gearing up to possibly be part of the of World War II, there were Maine did a registration drive. And there are 3,000 some of these forms at the state archives website. And they give you, um, like here, we have this Robert Beer. He was born in Budau, Czechoslovakia on November 21st, 1886. He's a doctor of chemistry. He's been in Maine for 7 months, where he works, speaks German, French, and Swedish. Um, no military service. Here's one. Here's Emma Pelletier living in Lewiston. She's been in the US 40 years. It gives the name of the town she was born in Quebec. Um, she doesn't really speak English, even though she's been here 40 years. She's single. She does housework. Um, and so these are often capturing. Now, this one, Robert Bean probably came by boat. So there's probably a passenger list for him. Um, but Emma probably crossed the land border. And there may not be another record of how long she's been here. She may have been back and forth in ways that weren't recorded. So that's just something to consider. And as I said, I'll talk more about some of those records when we're talking about finding origins. But I wanted to show you how working with those would let you possibly do some confirming of the pre-1891 passenger lists, or for border crossings that don't have paperwork. Any questions at this point? Assuming you all saw how that whole late 19th century increase in paperwork certainly applies to these kinds of records. Okay, well, I'm going to stop the video. Oops, where is it?